In the last week of May 1940, the British Army walked into the sea, not in defeat, in extraction. Operation Dynamo. The beaches of Dunkirk. And as 338,000 men waded toward the waiting vessels, they left behind what they could not carry: ammunition, vehicles, artillery, and more than 90,000 Lee-Enfield rifles stacked on the sand or sinking slowly into the shallows of the English Channel, their proof marks still legible on the barrel flats, their actions still timed to a tolerance of 0.004 of an inch. The War Office assessment was immediate. Britain had lost, in 5 days, the equivalent of 8 months of peacetime rifle production. Within 8 weeks, the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield Lock and the BSA works at Small Heath, Birmingham, had replaced every one of them. That is not a story about manufacturing. It is a story about what happens when a rifle becomes something more than a weapon, when it becomes the physical expression of a nation's capacity to survive. But the real story of the Lee-Enfield is not Dunkirk. It is the story of a Scottish émigré working in America, an English ballistician working in Somerset, and a war office that bound their names together. And then for the next 130 years, never let either of them go. Every week we tell the stories of the engineers, the works, and the decisions that built or destroyed the world's most important firearms. Give the video a like and subscribe if you want to keep hearing them. The story begins in Howick, Scotland, 1831. Howick is a mill town, a border town. Sitting in the Teviot Valley of Roxburghshire, in the Scottish lowlands, where the textile trade had run the economy for 2 centuries and where a working family's ambitions were measured in yards of wool, not in patents filed at Whitehall. James Paris Lee was born there in 1831. His father was a watchmaker. That detail matters. A watchmaker's son in a mill town learns, before he learns anything else, that the difference between a mechanism that works and one that fails is not the material. It is the tolerance, the fit of one part against another, the clearance of a moving surface, the spring rate of a component under load. Lee grew up understanding precision not as an abstraction but as a physical reality he could hold in his hands. The family emigrated to Canada when Lee was a child, settling in Osnabrück, Ontario. He served an apprenticeship in his father's trade. He taught himself gunsmithing from the bench upward. By his mid-20s he had crossed into the United States, and by 1858 he had submitted his first firearms patent, a breech-loading mechanism, to the United States Patent Office. He was 27 years old and working without institutional backing, without workshop capital beyond what he could earn, and without any guarantee that the War Office of any nation would ever look at what he was building. He moved between American cities, Milwaukee, Janesville, Madison, refining one central idea. Not the barrel, not the stock, the magazine. The problem was this: every major military rifle of the mid-19th century fed its cartridges one at a time. The soldier loaded, fired, reloaded. Under stress, under mud, under the particular darkness of a forward trench, that sequence broke down at its slowest point, the human hand reaching for the next cartridge. Lee's answer was a detachable box magazine, spring-loaded, carrying 10 rounds of ammunition in a self-feeding column that required no individual cartridge handling between shots. The soldier did not reload the rifle. He replaced the magazine. It was not, in 1879, a new concept. It was, in 1879, the first time anyone had made it work reliably enough for a War Office to consider it seriously. The War Office that considered it was British. The trials were held at Woolwich Arsenal. The year was 1880. Meanwhile, in Taunton, Somerset, a man named William Ellis Metford had spent the better part of 2 decades solving a different problem entirely. Metford was a civil engineer by training and a ballistician by compulsion. He had been studying the relationship between rifling geometry and projectile accuracy since the 1860s, specifically the problem of fouling. Black powder, the propellant of the era, deposited carbon residue into a rifle barrel at a rate that degraded accuracy measurably after the first dozen rounds. Metford's solution was a system of shallow, rounded grooves, 7 of them, cut in a progressive twist that reduced fouling accumulation without sacrificing the spin stabilization that rifling existed to provide. He called it segmental rifling. Independent tests conducted for the War Office in 1883 confirmed it as the most accurate barrel system then available to the British military. 2 men, 1 mechanism for feeding, 1 system for accuracy. Neither had sought the other out. The War Office brought them together. In 1888, the British Army adopted the magazine Lee-Metford. James Paris Lee's action and detachable magazine married to William Ellis Metford's barrel and rifling system. The rifle was manufactured at the Royal Small Arms Factory, Enfield Lock, Middlesex, on the River Lee, on a site that had been producing military arms for the Crown since 1816. Neither Lee nor Metford owned the result. The Crown did. That arrangement would define everything that followed. The magazine Lee-Metford of 1888 was not yet the rifle that would arm an empire. It was the proof of a principle, and like all proofs, it revealed as many problems as it solved. The barrel was the first to go. Metford's segmental rifling, 7 shallow grooves cut to minimize fouling from black powder, had been designed for a propellant that the British Army was already abandoning. In 1891, the War Office adopted cordite, a smokeless propellant that burned at a significantly higher temperature than black powder and eroded Metford's shallow grooves at a rate that rendered a service barrel unserviceable within a fraction of its expected lifespan. The solution was a new barrel, deeper grooves, 5 of them, cut in a uniform left-hand twist designed to withstand cordite's thermal load. The barrel was developed at the Royal Small Arms Factory itself. It bore the name of the place where it was made. In 1895, the magazine Lee-Metford became the magazine Lee-Enfield. William Ellis Metford's name left the designation. The rifle he had made accurate enough for military adoption no longer carried his mark. That is not a footnote. It is the first indication of how this story ends. The Lee-Enfield action, the component that remained, was built around Lee's detachable box magazine, a sheet steel housing, spring-loaded, carrying 10 rounds of .303 British cartridge in a staggered column. The .303 British, a rimmed centerfire cartridge, 7.7 millimeters in diameter, firing a 174-grain bullet at approximately 2,440 feet per second from a 25-inch barrel, was the standard British military cartridge from 1889 until 1954. Every Lee-Enfield ever built in Britain was chambered for it. The bolt was Lee's second great contribution, a rear locking design. The locking lugs positioned at the back of the bolt body rather than at the front, as was conventional, which shortened the bolt throw to just 60 degrees of rotation. 60 degrees. On a Mauser pattern rifle, the equivalent movement required 90. Those 30 degrees of difference do not sound significant. At the rate of aimed fire a trained British infantryman could sustain, they were the difference between 12 rounds per minute and 15 aimed rounds per minute. That figure was not a marketing claim. It was a documented War Office standard, confirmed in trials at Hythe School of Musketry and achieved in field conditions by trained soldiers of the British Expeditionary Force. It was the fastest sustained aimed fire rate of any bolt-action service rifle in history. The short magazine. Lee-Enfield, the SMLE Mark III, adopted in 1907, was the definitive expression of everything Lee and the Enfield Works had built toward. Shorter overall than its predecessors by nearly 5 inches, at 44.5 inches overall length and 8 pounds 10 ounces unloaded. A 10-round detachable magazine. A magazine cutoff, a small lever on the receiver that allowed the magazine to be held in reserve while the soldier loaded individual rounds from the top, preserving the full magazine for emergency use. a charger bridge machined into the receiver, allowing 10 rounds to be loaded from 2 5-round stripper clips in a single movement. Every component a response to a lesson learned in the field. Every refinement the product of a War Office trial, a height assessment, or a report from a colonial campaign. The SMLE Mark III entered production at RSAF Enfield at a unit cost of approximately £3 of 15 shillings, roughly 3 weeks' wages for a skilled machinist on the Enfield production floor. The Indian Army Ordnance Corps placed its first substantial order in 1908. The Canadian militia adopted it the same year. The Australian Imperial Force standardized on it before the first troop ships sailed for Gallipoli. By 1914, the Lee-Enfield was not one nation's service rifle. It was the standard arm of an empire that spanned a quarter of the Earth's surface. The War Office had not set out to build an imperial weapon. It had set out to solve a loading problem. The two things, it turned out, were the same. Proceeding to Layer 5. Glory and Scale. Target, approximately 1,200 words. 1,000 to 1,800, glory and scale. 10 o'clock, music. On the 4th of August, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. By the 5th, the War Office had issued mobilization orders to every arms production facility under Crown contract. At RSAF Enfield Lock, the night shift did not go home. At BSA, Small Heath Works on Golden Hillock Road, Birmingham, the production schedules were torn up and rewritten before dawn. The British Expeditionary Force that crossed to France in August 1914 carried the SMLE Mark III. 4 infantry divisions, approximately 100,000 men. Each man carried 150 rounds of .303 British ammunition and a rifle that had been proved at the Birmingham Proof House or inspected at Enfield to a tolerance that the War Office had spent 20 years refining. What happened next at Mons in late August 1914 passed into military legend and into a dispute about the nature of evidence that has not been fully resolved since. The German First Army, advancing in formation across open ground toward the British defensive line at the Mont-Condé Canal, encountered a volume of rifle fire that its own after-action reports described as machine gun fire. It was not. It was the SMLE Mark III in the hands of regular British infantrymen trained to the 15-round-per-minute standard at Hythe, firing section volleys with a speed and regularity that no bolt-action rifle was supposed to be capable of producing. German units reported casualties inconsistent with the number of British positions identified. The phenomenon acquired a name in the regimental histories, the Mad Minute. 15 aimed rounds, 60 seconds, 1 man, 1 rifle. The War Office had not planned for a war of 4 years. No procurement system had. By Christmas 1914, the original BEF had suffered casualties that stripped entire battalions of their trained riflemen. Kitchener's new army, the volunteer formations raised from August 1914 onward, required rifles by the hundreds of thousands at a rate that RSAF Enfield alone could not supply. The response was industrial mobilization on a scale Britain had never attempted. BSA Small Heath Works converted its full civilian production capacity, bicycles, motorcycles, machine tools, to Lee-Enfield manufacture. The London Small Arms Company at Old Ford, Bow, was brought into the supply chain. Contracts were placed with North American manufacturers, Winchester Repeating Arms in New Haven, Connecticut, and Remington Arms in Ilion, New York, both producing pattern 1914 Enfield rifles, a separate design derived from a pre-war experimental program, to supplement SMLE production. The Dominion arsenals accelerated. The Long Branch facility in Ontario, the Lithgow Small Arms Factory in New South Wales. Between 1914 and 1918, approximately 3.9 million Lee-Enfield rifles were produced across the Empire and its allied manufacturers. The figure does not include pattern 1914 production. It does not include rifles repaired, rebarreled, and returned to service. It represents, in steel and walnut and proof-marked barrel flats, the largest single sustained production run in the history of British military small arms. The women who made that number possible were rarely named in the production records. At RSAF Enfield, female machinists were trained on capstan lathes and milling machines from 1915 onward, replacing skilled male workers who had enlisted. By 1917, women constituted the majority of the production work. Several bay sections of the Enfield works. The rifles they made were submitted to proof, inspected, and passed into service, without distinction from those made by the men they had replaced. The War Office did not note this in its public communications. The rifles noted it in nothing at all. They functioned identically. The stakes were not abstract. An SMLE Mark III with a broken extractor, the small sprung component that grips the cartridge rim and withdraws the spent case from the chamber after firing, left a soldier in a forward position with a single round in the chamber and no means of clearing it under fire. At Passchendaele in 1917, where mud entered every mechanism that touched the ground, extractor failures were a documented operational concern. The Enfield Works responded with a strengthened extractor specification, introduced in the Mark III variant of 1916, which also simplified production by removing the magazine cutoff and long-range volley sights, refinements that war had made irrelevant and speed of manufacture had made unaffordable. The SMLE Mark III Star was not a lesser rifle. It was a rifle that understood what the war had become. By November 1918, the Lee-Enfield had been carried in the mud of Flanders, the sand of Sinai, the mountains of Mesopotamia, the scrub of East Africa, and the forward trenches of Gallipoli. It had been issued to the infantry of Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, and the West Indies. The Indian Army Ordnance Corps alone drew on a supply chain that ran from the Ishapur Rifle Factory on the Hooghly River in Bengal, producing Lee-Enfields under license since 1905, to forward ordnance depots in Baghdad and Jerusalem. The armistice did not end Lee-Enfield production, it redirected it. The interwar years produced the rifle's most technically accomplished variant. The No. 4 Mark I, introduced in 1941 after a developmental program that had begun in 1931, addressed the one consistent criticism the SMLE had attracted from armorers and instructors. The aperture rear sight, positioned at the back of the receiver rather than ahead of the action, gave a longer sight radius and a more precise aiming picture than the original blade and notch arrangement. The No. 4 was heavier than the SMLE by 12 ounces. It was also at the production tolerances achievable with 1940s machinery, significantly cheaper and faster to manufacture. When the Second War came, the production infrastructure built for the first was already in place. BSA Small Heath, RSAF Enfield, Long Branch, Ontario, and, from 1941, the Savage Arms plant in Chicopee Falls, Massachusetts, producing No. 4 Mark I rifles under Lend-Lease arrangements at a rate that supplemented British domestic capacity through the most critical period of the war. The Dunkirk rifles, those 90,000 actions left on the beaches of northern France, were replaced. The No. 4 Mark I that replaced them went to North Africa with the 8th Army, to Burma with the 14th Army, to Normandy with the 2nd Army, and to the Pacific with the Australian and New Zealand forces that fought under British command. Snipers operating with the No. 4 Mark I, T, a selected production example fitted with a No. 32 telescopic sight of 3.5 magnification, bedded and zeroed by armourer craftsmen at the Holland & Holland Works in Bruton Street, London, requisitioned for war production, achieved confirmed engagements at ranges beyond 800 yards. The rifle that a Scottish émigré had designed in an American workshop, that an English ballistician had made accurate in a Somerset study, and that the Crown had manufactured in its thousands at a factory on the River Lee in Middlesex, had become, without anyone quite planning it, the most widely produced and most geographically dispersed bolt-action service rifle in history. At its peak in 1943, the combined Allied production of Lee-Enfield pattern rifles across all variants and all manufacturing sites exceeded 12,000 units per week. 12,000 rifles. Every week. For 6 years. The rifle that had won 2 world wars was declared obsolete on the 16th of April, 1957. Not by an enemy, by the British Army itself. The announcement came not from the battlefield, but from a procurement memorandum. The L1A1 self-loading rifle, a semi-automatic design based on the Belgian Fabrique Nationale FAL, chambered for the new 7.62 by 51mm NATO cartridge, manufactured under license at RSAF Enfield, would replace the Lee-Enfield as the standard British service rifle. The decision was presented as modernization. It was also, though no memorandum said so directly, an admission that Britain's small arms industry would henceforth produce weapons designed elsewhere. The Lee-Enfield had not failed. It had simply been made politically inconvenient. The deeper story begins a decade earlier, in 1947, when the War Office convened a series of trials to identify a successor rifle for the post-war British Army. The leading domestic candidate was the EM2, a bullpup design, chambered for a new .280 British intermediate cartridge, developed at RSAF Enfield by a design team led by Stefan Kenneth Jansen. The EM2 was shorter than the Lee-Enfield, lighter, and capable of fully automatic fire. In independent trials conducted at Enfield in 1950 and 1951, it outperformed every competing design submitted, including early versions of what would become the M14 and the FNFAL. The British Army recommended adoption. The Minister of Defense concurred. Production tooling was being assessed. Then the United States Army declined to adopt the .280 British cartridge. NATO standardization, the political imperative of the early Cold War, required that all alliance members share a common rifle cartridge. The Americans had decided on 7.62 by 51mm. Britain, having invested years in the EM2 program, faced a choice between its domestic design and its Atlantic alliance. The government of Winston Churchill, returned to office in October 1951, made the decision that all governments in that position make. The EM2 was cancelled. The .280 British cartridge was abandoned. And RSAF Enfield, the facility that had developed the most technically advanced infantry rifle in the world, was directed to manufacture a Belgian design under license instead. Stefan Jansen's team was dispersed. The tooling assessments were filed. The EM2 prototypes went to the pattern room. The Lee-Enfield, meanwhile, did not disappear. It contracted. The Indian Army retained it. The Bangladesh Rifles adopted it. Commonwealth police forces across Africa, the Caribbean, and Southeast Asia continued to draw on wartime stocks and Ishapur production. The L-42A1, a Lee-Enfield No. 4 Mark I action, rebarreled in 7.62 by 51mm, NATO, fitted with a Schmidt and Bender telescopic sight, remained in service with British Army snipers until 1993. 36 years after the rifle had been declared obsolete, its action was still considered accurate enough to place a round on a target at 600 yards in the hands of a trained marksman. The Falklands War of 1982 produced the final irony. L1A1S LRs, the Belgian-designed rifles that had replaced the Lee-Enfield, proved difficult to handle in the saturated peat bogs and driving sleet of the South Atlantic. Several veteran NCOs who had qualified on the Lee-Enfield before its withdrawal commented in post-campaign assessments on the manual of arms that the SLR required in conditions that fouled its gas system. The Lee-Enfield had no gas system. Its bolt required nothing from the propellant gases except that they fire the cartridge. In mud, in cold, in the particular filth of a contested hillside at night. It cycled. No one reissued the Lee-Enfield. The observation was noted. Nothing was done with it. RSAF Enfield Lock, the factory on the River Lee that had produced military arms for the Crown since 1816, that had manufactured the pattern 1853 Enfield, the Martini Henry, the Lee-Metford, every mark of Lee-Enfield through 2 world wars, and the L1A1 SLR that replaced it, was privatized in 1984 under the Thatcher government's defense rationalization program. It was sold to British Aerospace. Production of military small arms at the Enfield site ceased in 1988. 172 years of continuous Crown manufacture. Ended by a property transaction, the site was subsequently redeveloped. The former factory buildings were converted to residential and commercial use as part of the Enfield Island Village development. A heritage trail was installed. Several of the original Victorian-era factory structures were granted listed building status. The capstan lathes that had bored Lee-Enfield barrels to a tolerance of 0.004 of an inch were auctioned. The craftsmen who had operated them retired. The apprenticeships that would have carried their knowledge forward had been discontinued a decade before the closure came. No document recorded what those men knew. The contracts ended, the proof marks stopped, the works went quiet. The name survived in collector catalogues and regimental histories. Nothing else remained on the River Lee. The Lee-Enfield did not die in 1957. It simply stopped being British. The Ishapur Rifle Factory on the Hooghly River in West Bengal, established under Crown license in 1905 to supply the Indian Army, continued producing Lee-Enfield pattern rifles after Indian independence in 1947, after the British withdrawal, after the partition, and after every political realignment that followed. The 2A and 2A1 variants, chambered for 7.62 by 51 mm NATO rather than .303 British, were produced at Ishapur into the 1970s. The Indian Army carried Lee-Enfield rifles in active infantry service until the early 1990s. In certain border and paramilitary formations, they remained in use beyond that. The Canadian Rangers, the part-time patrol force responsible for sovereignty operations across Canada's Arctic territories, were issued Lee-Enfield No. 4 rifles as their standard arm from the force's establishment in 1947. They carried them for 68 years. The decision to replace them, made in 2015, was driven not by any failure of the rifle but by the increasing difficulty of sourcing .303 British ammunition in the quantities required for training in remote locations. The replacement was the Colt Canada C19, a modern bolt-action design. Rangers who had carried the Lee-Enfield for decades noted in the consultation period that the new rifle would need to prove itself in conditions the old one had already survived for 2 generations. It is, by any measure, an extraordinary service life for a mechanism declared obsolete before most of those Rangers were born. Original production examples: SMLE, Mark III rifles bearing the broad arrow, War Office Acceptance Stamp, the RSAF Enfield Viewers Mark, and the Birmingham or London Proof House cartouche on the barrel flat, are actively collected through Holt's auctioneers, Bonham's Arms and Armour sales, and specialist dealers registered with the Historical Breech-Loading Small Arms Association. A matched, unissued SMLE Mark III in original finish with matching numbers commands between £800 and £1,400 at current auction. A confirmed No. 4 Mark I T sniper configuration with its original No. 32 scope and transit case has sold above £4,000. The premium is not sentimental. It reflects the impossibility of replication, the hand-fitting, the individual zeroing, the specific relationship between a selected action and a selected barrel that no production line has recreated since the Holland & Holland Works on Bruton Street closed their military contract in 1945. The National Firearms Centre at Nottingham, the successor institution to the Pattern Room collection formerly held at RSAF Enfield, holds the definitive developmental series of Lee-Enfield variants, from the original magazine Lee-Metford of 1888 through every mark and sub-variant to the L-42A1 sniper rifle. It is the most complete institutional record of a single rifle's evolution in any British collection. 3 people with appointments and a research purpose can examine it on a Tuesday afternoon. The surprise that the production record does not foreground. William Ellis Metford, the Somerset ballistician whose rifling system made the original Lee Metford accurate enough for War Office adoption, and whose name was removed from the designation in 1895 when his barrel was replaced, left the bulk of his personal estate to fund scholarships at the Bristol School of Mines, the institution that trained the engineers who built the industrial infrastructure that Britain would need for the next war. He did not leave a note explaining the connection. He may not have made one consciously, but the money went where it went. The Lee-Enfield is not a story about a company. No company owned it. No founder built it for profit. No conglomerate acquired it and extracted the value from its name. It was designed by a Scottish émigré who died in New Jersey in 1904, never having seen the war his magazine system would define. It was made accurate by an English engineer who died in 1899, 2 years before the rifle that erased his name would be carried to South Africa in the hands of British soldiers fighting the first modern war of the 20th century. It was manufactured by the Crown, proved at the Crown's proof houses, issued under the Crown's authority, and declared obsolete by the same authority, while continuing to function in the hands of soldiers on 4 continents for another 4 decades. That is not a legacy. That is a standard. And somewhere in the Canadian Arctic tonight, in a ranger detachment on a sovereignty patrol above the tree line, there is almost certainly still a number 4 Lee-Enfield in a transit case that has not been opened since the last exercise. The action still times correctly. The bore is clean. The proof mark on the barrel flat is still legible. It was made at Enfield, on the River Lee, in Middlesex, by people whose names are not recorded anywhere that 3 people on a Tuesday can find. It still works. If you want to hear the stories of the engineers, the works, and the weapons that defined an era, subscribe, and we will keep finding them. See you in the next one.